Tonight, the Prime Minister defends his decision to strike Houthi targets in Yemen and says it was a response to the biggest attack on the British Navy in decades. Rishi Sunak tells MPs the UK won't hesitate to take further action to protect itself in the Red Sea. But while the Prime Minister was speaking in the Commons, a developing story this evening, American officials say Houthis in Yemen have attacked a US-owned ship. Also tonight, a damning report finds police left children at the mercy of grooming gangs in Rochdale. But what lessons, if any, have been learned? Controversy over a major new poll which suggests the Conservatives could be heading for a 1997-style wipeout as the man behind the Tory election strategy briefs MPs tonight. And failure to launch. We're christening our new studio tonight. Will it go better or worse than some of these famous political set pieces? Better, I hope. All that and more with Sarah Champion and Liam Fox, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Monday. I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Politics Hub, and also welcome to our very new studio, right here in the heart of the newsroom in Westminster. We're gearing up for a big election year in both the UK and the US. Now, in contrast with our brand new look, there are some more familiar stories I'm going to be discussing tonight. Firstly, the official start of the US election campaign with the caucuses in Iowa, dominated by one pretty familiar face. I mean, I don't need to tell you who that is, do I? Also a round of US-UK airstrikes in the Middle East. We've also heard that story before, many times in recent history. Rishi Sunak has been in the House of Commons today outlining why the strikes against the Houthi militant group were the right thing to do after their repeated attacks on international shipping. And, you know, it does feel like there is broad agreement in the diplomatic community and in the Labour Party that the targeted strikes were proportionate. So no wonder Rishi Sunak's comfortable talking about the decision, and no wonder the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, was happy to speak about it in an address this morning as well. But when the government so clearly do want to talk about something, I can't help wondering what it is they don't want to talk about quite so much. The increasingly difficult and depressing war in the Middle East, which has exposed the limits of Western diplomacy. The UK defence capability, whether we really are the global player we like to imagine ourselves as being, and the US election and what that means for global security. You know, if Donald Trump wins, will America still want to be the policeman of the world? And what happens if not? We'll try and answer, or at least look at, some of those questions too on this evening's show. But first, on a day when the government's been outlining the various security threats that the UK faces, here's our political editor, Beth Rigby.
Perfect. Good.
Monday morning in Southend, the PM back on regional tours after a weekend in which he took decisions of global significance, sanctioning airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen and signalling there could be more to come.
I think it's incumbent on the Houthis to recognise the international condemnation for what they're doing and desist. But we, of course, will not hesitate to protect our security where required.
Back to Westminster later in the day and to the Commons to explain his decision to MPs. Rishi Sunak clear, enough was enough.
This action was taken in self-defence. It was limited, not escalatory. It was a necessary and proportionate response to a direct threat to UK vessels and therefore to the UK itself.
And the operation successful.
Our initial assessment is that all 13 planned targets were destroyed.
The Labour leader keen to project unity, but warning this cannot escalate to a wider conflict.
Let me reiterate that Labour backs this targeted action to reinforce maritime security in the Red Sea.
Rishi Sunak has always found it easy to build consensus on the world stage. But when it comes to his own backyard, well, his premiership tells a very different story. This week, he's battling 60 of his own MPs who believe that his flagship Rwanda plan simply won't work. while polling out today points to a Tory wipeout in the next general election not seen since 1997. And the message from the right is clear: sort it out or face electoral oblivion. Tonight, the Prime Minister's campaign guru met the 1922 committee of backbench Tories, attempting to firm up party discipline ahead of 2 days of debate over whether his Rwanda bill is workable. The pushback for this PM is not about the decisions he takes abroad, but what he's doing here at home. His party backing him over the Middle East and Ukraine, but in all-out war over his plan to tackle small boats. It's one he must win. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, the instability in the Red Sea continues to feed into a growing sense of economic instability across the world. Just in the last half hour, a Houthi military spokesman has given us some details after the attack that we've been hearing about earlier on a US-owned ship. Now, they said that Houthi naval forces carried out a military operation targeting an American ship in the Gulf of Aden with missiles. They also said that they consider all American and British vessels and warships participating in aggression against them as hostile targets. So that is the latest from a Houthi spokesperson. Well, let's bring in our economics editor, Ed Conway. He's at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Very snowy backdrop for you, Ed. We've been talking a lot on the programme about the military consequences and I guess the sort of security consequences of the Houthi situation in the Red Sea. But there's going to be economic consequences as well. What are they?
Yeah, and then this is, I mean, we are at the start of the World Economic Forum in Davos. This event happens every year, or it did other than the pandemic. And really, you could hardly choose a kind of more appropriate forum for lots of people, whether it's plutocrats, people that run businesses, politicians, and various campaigners, to come together. I mean, this is the kind of forum that is desperately interested in events like what we're seeing in the Red Sea, and in a concerned way. You have deep concern that, well, this in some ways is the home of globalisation. This is a group of people who have become very successful thanks to free trade moving around the world, and now they're faced with this issue, which is that you can't necessarily rely on those shipping lanes that you could rely on before. And they're asking themselves the question as to whether this is going to be a permanent thing or whether this is another sign of a potential new Cold War, certainly a more fractured economic situation around the world. So definitely, if there is one issue that people here are likely to be talking about most, and you know already it hasn't really begun officially, it's just beginning tonight, but already the kind of one or two conversations I've had so far, this is the issue. It is about whether this is going to cause big economic implications elsewhere. The good news, just looking at the statistics, and you know we've talked about this a little bit before, is so far, oil prices haven't risen. So far, gas prices, they've actually fallen, despite the fact that we've just heard from Qatar about them not actually using the Red Sea either. So far, there hasn't been a dramatic impact to this. But it's early days, and people are starting just to adapt to this and to try and work out, is this just a new world we're living in? We have many people, very interesting people, coming from all over the place who are going to be talking at this summit over the course of the next few days. Some of them are controversial figures, some of them less so. We have the Prime Minister of Qatar, for instance, talking tomorrow. We have the Premier of China. Antony Blinken will be here as well, the US Secretary of State. And for the UK, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. And as well as that, you have other ministers, and most kind of notably, actually is not from the government. It's that Rachel Reeves is here as well, and Jonathan Reynolds from Labour starting to make their case about how they could well be the party of government this time next year. So it's an interesting kind of event. But as you say, I think there's one issue that people are quite nervous about, and it is what's happening in the Red Sea. There's all sorts of things on the agenda, but it's often the way. They've come here to this mountain town to try and talk about things, but they end up basically focusing on whatever is the big issue of the day. It was COVID before, it was what was happening in Ukraine. Doubtless it's going to continue to be what's happening in Ukraine. You've got President Zelensky talking tomorrow. It's going to be also what's happening in the Middle East as well. You've got the President of Israel talking here as well. But it is the economic story. It's the question of whether we are seeing a breakdown in global trade at the moment, and indeed whether what we're seeing in the Red Sea is a presaging more dangerous times to come.
And of course, that matters to people at home as well, if it starts feeding through in higher prices, hitting people in their pockets too. Ed, thank you very much indeed. Ed Conway there from a very snowy Davos. Well, let's talk a bit more about this new age of global security. The Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, told Sky's Trevor Phillips yesterday it's hard to think of a time when there's been so much danger in the world. And the government's defence commitments in recent days really do speak to that as well. Late last week, 4 RAF Typhoon aircraft were involved in airstrikes on targets in Yemen. Now, that's in addition to 3 Royal Navy warships, part of the effort to protect shipping in the Red Sea. On top of that, the UK's continuing commitment to Ukraine, with Rishi Sunak announcing a £2.5 billion military aid package both this year and next. And finally, there's a commitment of 20,000 troops to NATO's Steadfast Defender exercise. That's one of the biggest since the Cold War, involving all 3 services, the Army, Navy and the RAF. Right, let's talk, shall we, about that dangerous world that David Cameron was referring to. We're joined now by Kurt Volker, who served as the US ambassador to NATO. Thank you so much for being with us today. Well, as you know, the UK and US have launched strikes on the Houthis, a militia group who've been backed by Iran, targeting ships in the Red Sea. In your view, was that the right thing to do?
Absolutely. I don't see any question that the reason that those attacks by the Houthis on international shipping took place was because they believed that there would be no response. They had already sent so many missiles against US forces in the region. Iran has launched attacks through Hamas, through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, and there was almost no response. And so they believed they could do this with impunity. In order to get this back in the box, it was essential to actually hit back at the Houthis and to show that we are willing to do it again. We have to reestablish a sense of deterrence against this kind of behavior.
I mean, how concerned are you about the risk of potential escalation? I mean, is that something we should be worried about, going into a direct conflict with Iran?
Quite the opposite. I think that the risks are on the side of inaction. If you don't take action, then you see things like what the Houthis were doing begin to occur. It's important to establish that there is a deterrent to that kind of behavior. And so doing this will help reestablish that. There is a temporary risk of more exchange of military force from both sides. And there is even the possibility that there may be a need to engage Iran directly to drive the message home. But hopefully this avoids the kind of massive escalation that could otherwise occur just through inaction.
It's interesting, you're talking there about the risk of inaction. And it feels to me like we could be at a bit of a crossroads when it comes to America policy. We've seen the election campaign, getting going today with the Iowa caucuses. The former president, Donald Trump, has been someone who's often talked about, isolationism. Like, is it right to be committing troops abroad? Is that a concern for you?
It's not. And particularly when we're talking about Iran and the Middle East, President Trump was very aggressive towards Iran. He had a policy that was called maximum pressure. It was sanctions, it was military pressure. And I'm sure that he would be pushing for the same thing now. So I think President Biden doesn't really have to worry about pushback coming from the right. He will have pushback from the left. There are always those on the Democratic side who want to see some kind of negotiation with Iran, who prioritize a nuclear agreement with Iran over these regional issues. But as we've seen, at least as I believe we've seen, Iran takes advantage of that desire to negotiate to then press with its own proxies a military conflict.
Now, as the former US Special Envoy to Ukraine, I'm interested in your views on Russia's role here, because, of course, Iran has been arming Russia. In your view, is this all connected? Former president talked about an axis of evil. Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, there's certainly an axis. We have Russia and Iran working together very closely. Most of the drones that Russia fires at Ukraine almost every night come from Iran, recently manufactured as well. So Russia has really developed a dependency on Iran's military equipment. At the same time, Iran wanted to press this advantage in the Middle East that it feels it has with an apparently weaker US, weaker West, and a vulnerable Netanyahu, and got Russia's acquiescence to do so. And Russia has then offered some help in exchange to Iran, things that we would not have seen even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. So I do think there's a connection here. And remember, if you're in Israel or if you are in Ukraine, the drones that you were seeing in the skies attacking you are the very same drones from the very same source.
I'm really interested to hear your sort of take on that. And I'm wondering as well if you could give me a take on a different question. And don't feel like you have to be polite in answering this, by the way. Here in the UK, we like to see ourselves as, international players when it comes to defence. Are we?
Definitely the UK is. There's different ways to look at it. The UK went through a period of reduction of its military capabilities and also, frankly, diplomatic capabilities over a period of many, many years. That has begun to be reversed, but it is a long-term effort to reverse that, to reinvest in military capabilities, reinvest in diplomatic capabilities. One of the interesting things is that the UK has shown more independence of action after leaving the European Union. The EU is still stuck in long negotiations over just about everything, whereas the UK can do things like send Storm Shadows and NLAWs to Ukraine on time, as opposed to much delayed, as we've seen from the European Union countries and Germany.
That's interesting, that actually leaving the EU, in your view, does give a bit more flexibility, I guess, to the United Kingdom in that regard. How would you rate...
Provided the investment is made in the capabilities, yes.
Yeah, well, how would you rate the current capability then?
It needs further investment. As I said, it's a long-term effort to turn it around. I think that effort is underway, but a lot more has to be done.
Okay. Now, you work with Donald Trump. You're his special envoy to Ukraine. If he's elected president, do you think he would make the world a safer place?
I think it's completely unpredictable. And I think that is what he prides himself on, in fact, is that he's someone who judges the situation at the time, makes his own decision, doesn't want to be surrounded by a bunch of advisors who tell him what to do. It's very unpredictable. There are some people who say he's going to threaten to leave NATO. John Bolton recently made a comment to that effect in an article. And yet at the same time, by the time it was at the end of his first presidential term, if he gets a second one, but at the end of his presidential administration, he was very supportive of NATO because he took credit for getting NATO countries to invest $70 billion more in defense. So it is just very unpredictable what he would do. I do think that it's a time when we need American leadership. It's a time when we need support against our adversaries and working together with our allies and our partners. And whoever is elected president, and we simply don't know who that will be at this point, I hope that is the direction we go in.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting to get your perspective this evening.
Thank you.
Right, let's bring in our duo for tonight, shall we? The Labour MP for Rotherham, that's Sarah Champion, and the former Defence Secretary, Dr. Liam Fox. It's great to have you both on the programme today. Liam, we should go to you first after that interview. It was really interesting, I thought, to hear the view that actually, look, there's an opportunity there for Britain outside of the EU, but we need to start spending an awful lot more money on defence.
Well, you can see already, what we are bringing to this particular coalition. When in 2010 we had the major defence review, the decision was taken that Britain's major contribution would be maritime. So we have our nuclear deterrent, our constant at sea nuclear deterrent. We have our new carrier strike capabilities, which is actually carrying a lot of American Marine Corps F-35 aircraft at the present time. So there's been an increased interoperability.
Is there enough money?
There's never enough money if you're a defence secretary in terms of what you could spend. The question is not so much that, but as Kurt Volker was saying there, what we spend it on and the shape of that and overall what NATO is able to do. And, the United States has got a defence budget that's bigger than the next 11 in the world combined. It's hard to understand the scale of that. And therefore it can have full spectrum defence capabilities. No other country can really afford that, and we can't. So there needs to be a proper debate inside NATO about who does what and who does what most effectively. Yes. We decided that there would be a very strong maritime component to the UK. We're a country where over 90% of our trade comes by sea. And so the protection of the sea lanes is absolutely crucial to not just our economic, but our security needs as a country. So that, I think, makes sense for us. But, of course, a lot of the threats that come to us are invisible threats in cyber, for example, the increasing potential for conflict in space. We will need to invest in a lot of things that we won't necessarily be able to see, which I think is a bit frustrating for a lot of our traditional services who love to be able to review their troops and the ships and aircraft. A lot of our capabilities won't be visible capabilities because a lot of the threats are not. We are in the war of the invisible enemy in the era in which we live.
Sarah, I'm interested in your perspective on this. Because, look, it's easy to say, isn't it, that, yes, we should spend more money on defence, we need to play a leading role in the world. And Keir Starmer, I feel, has been trying to kind of match the Conservatives as closely as possible. But at the same time, you know, some of our viewers were thinking, I'd like a bit more money to be spent on my local hospital or my local school. What's your view?
It is tough, and this comes down to political decisions, and probably one of the key things that comes out in the general election, where those priorities are. I mean, for me, throughout my time as a parliamentarian, I've been trying to prevent things from happening, early intervention, because I think that that's much cheaper. And when we're talking about our defence spend, we have to remember that we're not just sort of running to keep still. We've actually seen a 28% reduction in our troops since 2010. You know, we've seen, well, potentially seeing warships being mothballed because we haven't got enough service personnel to staff them. So I completely agree with what Liam's saying about the sort of the changing nature. But there are things that we can do that don't actually cost that much money. So, for example, in space, which I agree is a real concern about all the cyber damage that could happen, we could lead an international agreement on, you know, what does and doesn't happen in space. At the moment, it's the Wild West. So there are things that we can do that will protect all of us. But also, sort of specifically looking at Yemen, one of the things that concerns me since 2015, most of the country has been under attack from the Houthis. You know, the level of internal displacement, 4.5 million people internally displaced. And I'm really grateful that now we're focusing on that region, but I would have liked a long time ago for us to be trying to stabilise what's been going on in that country.
Not just on shipping, but actually on people who are getting bombed or vulnerable people.
Exactly right.
But of course, on that, when Saleh fell, the regime fell, and the Houthis were taking advantage of that. When the Saudis tried to stabilise that, they were getting enormous criticism, not least in our parliament, for doing so. The Houthis have attacked Saudi Arabia, they've attacked the UAE. Basically, anyone who is an enemy of Iran will be attacked by the Houthis.
That's the nub of it.
And he really is, isn't it, the nub of the issue. That we know that Iran does not want there to be peace between Israel and Arab states because Iran does not want Israel to exist. And that really is, well, that's the key problem in all of this. And whether it's Hamas, funded and armed by Iran, Hezbollah, funded and armed by Iran, the Houthis, funded and armed by Iran, we're seeing the same picture. These are Iranian proxies who are carrying out anti-Western and, in fact, even anti-Arab countries if Iran regards them as a threat to them.
Complicated issues to be discussing tonight. Thanks both for your contributions on those. Well, the situation in the Middle East is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and The Sun's political editor, that's Harry Cole. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, young girls left at the mercy of gangs of paedophiles. We'll look at the shocking findings of a report into grooming in Rochdale.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake might all be finished, I don't know.
Hello, welcome back. Now, a report has been published today into grooming gangs in Rochdale. And honestly, it is pretty unbelievable reading. It found that girls were left at the mercy of paedophile gangs for years because of an inadequate response by police and council bosses, and yet you might think of stronger words than inadequate to describe that response as well. The report also identified 96 men still thought to be a potential risk to children. Now, Sarah, I know in particular you've done an awful lot of work on this in your own constituency. We're going to be talking to you more about that in a moment. But first, let's just get the details on today's report. This is from our Home editor, Jason Farrell.
The women who blew the whistle on police failures to investigate a grooming gang. Today, vindicated. Former sexual health worker Sarah Rowbotham, visibly emotional, angry that she'd not been believed.
I was described as being difficult to work with. Well, what did you expect? Children were being raped every day. The scale of abuse was known to protective services at the time, and they chose not to take appropriate action. Someone needs to explain why.
Operation Span was deemed a success when it led to the prosecution of 9 men in 2012. But report authors today said they identified 96 individuals in the town of Rochdale who potentially pose a risk to children, many still walking the streets. So today came this apology to the victims.
One of the primary responsibilities of the police is to protect the vulnerable from the cruel and the predatory. And in this regard, we failed you. The lessons from our past have been well and truly learned.
But Maggie Oliver, a detective from Operation Span who resigned in disgust at police failings over a decade ago, refuted that claim, telling the Chief Constable directly that victims were still being failed.
I have current information about what is going on today. And I would say categorically, and I am sorry, Mr. Watson, but the failures that happened then are still happening now.
Andrea, not her real name, was a victim of sexual grooming in Greater Manchester 20 years ago. Abused from the age of 11, she said authorities blamed her.
As I got older, I realised what they were doing. Because I was being groomed, they called me a prostitute.
They were actually using that word?
Yes, they all labelled me a prostitute.
She says a young relative is being sexually exploited now, and history is repeating itself.
Greater Manchester Police are silencing everyone. They still don't want to hear what's going on. You have to beg and beg and beg for them to help. They'll find any excuse. Show me one thing they're doing differently from when I was a child.
But the Chief Constable insists much has changed.
But what is absolutely clear is that the mistakes, the systemic failures to protect children of 10 and 20 years ago in Rochdale, as night follows day, could not be repeated in Manchester today. Of that I am confident.
The report also condemned some police officers who failed to engage with the inquiry.
I also want to say shame and every individual who was asked to give evidence to this inquiry but refused to do so. When you failed to take appropriate action to protect children, or you failed to investigate crimes, shame on you.
Manchester's mayor is calling for people to be compelled to give evidence in the next investigation, which will examine how victims are being treated now. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Jason Farrell reporting there, and coming up next on the Politics Hub, we are going to be talking more about this story, getting some reaction from our panel, including from Sarah, who's got huge experience on this issue from her work as the MP for Rotherham. There's also been a lot of controversy today over a big YouGov poll predicting a 1997-style landslide for the Conservatives in a general election. We'll tell you why. That's next. Hello, welcome back. Well, before the break, we were just hearing about that report into child grooming in Rochdale, which outlined a series of failings by police and council bosses in the area. Well, let's bring in Sarah and Liam at this point, shall we? Honestly, it's one of these stories that I find quite hard to read about, to get into the details of, because I just find it so depressing that these girls weren't protected, but also just weren't believed, weren't valued.
I don't want to sound cynical, but I've been working with victims and survivors of child sexual abuse by organised gangs for 12 years now. And the level of disgusting depravity that they were subjected to repeatedly over decades, some of them, it's chilling, but I think I find equally frustrating and unforgivable is the fact that when they were trying, desperately trying to report their crimes, the very people that they were looking to protect them were calling them prostitutes, calling them slags, saying that if they hang around with people like that, what did they expect was going to happen? In some cases, getting criminalised themselves for being prostitutes, you know, at 15, 16, and still having that on their record now, some of them. And I'd love to tell you that it's all changed, but it hasn't. And the report makes it very clear that some of the perpetrators are still there, on the same streets, known to the victims and survivors, and I would put money on it, still doing their same despicable practices, because leopards don't change their spots, I'm afraid.
That's incredibly depressing. Why do you think it is that they weren't believed? Do you think it is because police were reluctant to, I guess, you know, a lot of people believe that for issues of political correctness, you know, they weren't willing to go over after Asian grooming gangs? Do you think it's because it's that misogyny about working class, vulnerable young women? Bit of both?
I think it's a lot of things that came together. I mean, I find it really offensive that they didn't just deal with these people as criminals and abusers. And the fact that race came into it, which from a number of both independent and Home Office reports, that clearly was a factor why police pulled back. I mean, I just find that wicked and pretty stupid, to be quite honest. You should deal with criminals as criminals, regardless of where they come from. I think there was misogyny. I think it was also a class thing. These were seen as working class girls, worthless, couldn't be trusted, didn't need the support and protection. What I would like to see, which we haven't really seen in Rotherham, and I haven't really seen across the country, is the people with those attitudes, some of whom are still in the police and are still in councils, having disciplinary. And it's all very well for the Chief Inspector to say all lessons have been learnt. No, they haven't. We need to actually see that. You know, we need to trust our police forces to go after the criminals and to believe us. If I came and reported my car being stolen to the police, I wouldn't expect to be challenged over that. Yes, I'd have to evidence it, but I wouldn't expect to be criminalised myself. But that's what happened to these girls when they tried to report a crime.
That's unbelievable, really. Liam, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I find the whole thing so rancid and sordid that it's almost not believable, except that it's really happened. And it seems to me that here's a classic case of blaming the victims for a crime. And a lot of these victims, a lot of these young girls were regarded almost as worthless. And that's what I find so distasteful about the whole thing. And I agree with Sarah, it's one thing, when you say that we've learned our lessons, as the Chief Constable said in your video, and yet there are cases of some of these same people still walking the streets, posing a threat to the same sorts of young girls over and over again. It is just not acceptable. It doesn't matter whether it was misogyny, whether they were afraid of stirring up racial antipathy, whatever it was. They have a duty, the police, to investigate those. And it is the duty to protect those who are victims of crime. And it seems that almost everything here was wrong. I mean, I would very much like to see the Home Affairs Committee in the House of Commons look into this, because leaving it as, well, that's what happened in a region of England isn't enough. We need to have proper guidelines. And again, I agree with Sarah that it's not just the police, it's other agencies. Who's going to be accountable when these things happen? Because it's not acceptable to say really horrible things happened and we're sorry and we've learned our lessons. Who carries the can for that? Somebody has to.
And in Rotherham, we're very fortunate because we've got the National Crime Agency doing specialist investigations, and they've managed to get a lot of prosecutions through. But the availability or lack of availability of court time is really slowing everything down. And what a lot of the survivors say is it over a prolonged period to have to relive all of the trauma that they went through without the support in many cases that they need to get through it. They see that as a secondary form of abuse, and I can understand that. We need to get so much better in this country, both about believing victims and whistleblowers, but also getting them justice in a timely manner.
Thanks both very much. It's the kind of individual stories that get you here, and there's a girl called Child 44 that I've been sort of reading into today. It's absolutely unbelievable what happened to her. She had an abortion after being raped when she was a young teenager. The police then took that fetus without telling her to do a DNA test and just kept it in a freezer. It's extraordinary. She then ended up bumping into her abuser in Asda after he was released, and they didn't even bother telling her that he'd been released.
And that's still happening now.
Thanks both very much. A difficult thing to talk about, I know, but I really appreciate having you both on the programme this evening. Well, it's not that often that an opinion poll creates enough wave to generate responses from the party leaders, but that was the case from a major YouGov survey of 14,000 people, which suggested that the Conservatives could suffer a 1997-style collapse, falling to just 169 seats. That would mean Labour would have a majority of 120. Well, here's what Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer said earlier.
There have been lots of polls over the last year. There'll be hundreds more polls. The only one that matters is the one when the general election comes. And the choice of that election is clear. It's to stick with our plan that is working. It's delivering change for people, ensuring that they can have the peace of mind that there's a brighter future for their children, that we can have renewed pride in our country, or the alternative, which is Keir Starmer and going back to square one with him. He can't say what he will do. He's been leader of the opposition for 4 years now. He hasn't said what he'd do differently, and that's because he doesn't have a plan. So that's the choice. Stick with the plan that is delivering change, making a difference, or go back to square one.
My message to every single Labour Party member, every single MP, every single candidate is ignore that poll. We have to earn every vote, respect every vote, and we should always, always fight like we're 5% behind.
Ignore that poll. Not sure it would be quite as easy as that. And with that poll looming on their minds and ahead of votes on the government's Rwanda policy this week, Conservative MPs have been meeting in Parliament. They've been addressed by the Conservatives' election strategist, Isaac Levido. You can see him on your screen now. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, was lurking outside. He joins us now from Central Lobby in Parliament. John, what have you been finding out?
Well, it's been one of those great evenings for fans of the soap opera of politics. It beats EastEnders or Corrie. Now, the evening the last few hours have been quite dramatic with events moving really fast. Just after 6 o'clock this evening, I was here broadcasting on Sky News when behind me, the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, was deep in conversation with the Chief Whip. Well, why is that significant? Because, of course, Lee Anderson has been threatening over the past 24 hours to join the rebels in the Rwanda debate tomorrow. I shouted at him, "You're going to resign, you're going to resign." Well, he didn't answer. Minutes later, however, Mr. Anderson tweeted saying he was not only going to put his name to some of the rebel amendments, but vote for them too. And we also heard that a second deputy chairman, Brendan Clark-Smith, was going to do the same. Now, while all this was going on, there were various meetings. There was a meeting of the right-wing rebels over there in Committee Room 9, Danny Kruger and the Kruger crew. And then over in Portcullis House, there was the One Nation group. And then at 6:15, there was a meeting of the 1922 committee addressed by Mr. Levido. Now, outside that meeting in Portcullis House, rebel MPs were claiming that anyone who was a party official, a deputy chairman or a PPS, a bag carrier for a minister, would not be sacked if they backed the rebel amendments. Well, that was later denied by the Chief Whip. I spoke to Mr. Clark-Smith, who said to me, I said, "Are you going to get sacked?" And he said, "I don't know, we'll see. It's not for me to decide." Then Andrea Jenkins, always one of the first to demand a change of leader, certainly since Mr. Sunak's been Prime Minister. She tweeted this: "Two deputy chairmen who will need to resign or be sacked for signing an amendment, hopefully more to come. And this will be accompanied with vote of no confidence letters to the 1922 committee chairman," that's Sir Graham Brady, "so we can get a new and true Conservative leader." Well, that was incendiary. And what was the message from Mr. Levido upstairs in the Boothroyd room? Well, we heard the same slogans we just heard from Mr. Sunak. Stick to the plan, Labour haven't got a plan. But at the end of his speech, he delivered this stark warning on the eve of this showdown between the government and the Rwanda rebels. He said, "People don't vote for divided parties fail." Well, I have to say, when the MPs came out of that meeting, there were some pretty glum faces. One ex-cabinet minister said, I said, "Was it optimistic or pessimistic?" And they said, "Realistic," in a rather glum way. So great drama on the eve of this big showdown tomorrow. More excitement tomorrow.
Yeah, it certainly will be. John Craig there for us in Central Lobby. Thanks, John. We'll be talking about that YouGov poll in the Daily Telegraph that sparked a lot of controversy and commentary today. Our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, is here to explain why. Sam, it feels like we should start off with the poll itself and what it actually showed.
That's right. There's only one poll tonight being disowned by everybody up to and including the Tory election chief Isaac Levido in the last hour, and that's the YouGov poll. It's a MRP which tries to project what's happening in every constituency. Let's have a look at it. This is 2019. This is the state of Britain, every constituency after Boris Johnson won in December 2019. See all the blue, all the yellow for the SNP. Right, now look at just how that changes. Keep an eye over here. And it's quite something. When
the
it
drama.
Comes.
Here we go.
Here it is.
Wow, look at that.
You can see swathes of red here. This is quite a dramatic result. It's also a dramatic result, though it doesn't quite look like it in Scotland's rural, because of Scotland's rural constituencies. Here, with lots of Labour seats being gained in Scotland from the SNP.
So what's this? This is a landslide for Labour, is that what this is?
This is a massive result. This is 120 majority for Labour. Let's look at the figures, what the House of Commons would look like under this. You can see Labour at the highest end of their expectations. They'll go up 183 seats. I have to say, 169 seats is all the Tories would have left, well under the 200 that many of them hope to keep. Liberal Democrats running very high. I don't think they think they're going to get more than about 25, but this poll puts them on 48 seats. SNP basically see their votes cut in half. Reform, you can see down here, Reform, you actually get no seats under this plan. And I think that would be a seismic change to our politics. Let's look at one more reason why I think actually the Tories might be quite nervous, and that's this. This is the implied vote shares. What proportion of people would vote for this for each party? And actually, compared to current polls, the Labour Party doesn't do particularly well. You know, the Labour Party currently in polling is at about 45, 46. This takes account of the idea that in an election campaign, there's a squeeze between the incumbent and the party out in front. So this even kind of...
Could be even worse if the polls are correct.
It could be absolutely the worst. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because of the size of the change, all parties are incredibly nervous about it.
Yeah, don't look at the poll, we're told. Well, obviously we have been looking at the poll. There's been a lot of controversy about this, though, right? I feel like at about 10 p.m. last night, my Twitter account, or X, as I should say, just exploded. What's going on?
So the point about it is this poll has been weaponised. It has been commissioned. It has been commissioned by an unknown group called the Conservative Britain Alliance, which we are told by the Daily Telegraph, who published it all, is a group of Tory donors. But we've never heard of them. There's no trace of them. None of them have come forward. And there are suspicions that actually quite a few people behind it might be some part of Reform UK, because aside from the poll, the Telegraph also published this extensive analysis about just the impact of Reform UK, the party to the right of the Conservatives, making the argument that unless the Tory party backs much tougher migration plans on this big vote on Wednesday, it faces obliteration. So who stands to win from that? It's causing some consternation. That tonight has led Isaac Levido, the Tory election chief, to warn that he is worried that there are some people inside the Tories, maybe working with other parties, who are working effectively, have thrown in the towel and are working against this election result. It's interesting to see whether or not whether we'll ever find out who is behind the poll and whether or not he's proved right.
I really feel like that kind of weaponised polling. We're getting into election year, aren't we? Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there. Right, let's chat to Sarah and Liam, shall we? Liam, bad news.
Well, if the election was tomorrow and that was the result of the election, yes, it would be a big Labour majority. Wow. I don't think any of us find that particularly surprising, but it's not. That's not the election tomorrow. We've got a long way, and most of us who can remember fighting real elections, like 92, when Labour were supposed to win outright in that election, we won outright in that election, much to everyone's surprise. In 1987, Mrs Thatcher had a couple of really bad years where we'd lost very many of our seats in local government. In the 6 months up to the election, the government recovered. Mrs Thatcher won a majority of 103. So it is...
OK, it's a good case for the defence.
Well, no, but the other thing is what I think most of us on the streets are finding at the moment, a lot of voters undecided. They just haven't decided what they're going to do. It's not like the run-up to 97. In 97, Labour had one weapon, which they don't have today, which was Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a very charismatic leader, and people were deciding to go all the way across. Most of the Tory voters that I find who are not with us at the moment haven't gone to Labour, they've gone to undecided or won't vote. And that's up to the government to attract them back. Every election is a different dynamic. And I think, as with all elections, it will come down to a choice. It's either going to be a Labour government or a Conservative government. If people vote reform, they'll end up with a Labour government. That's how it works.
Sarah, Labour MPs been told to ignore this poll, but that's easier said than done. Come on. Labour MPs must be looking at this saying, oh, this is great news, let's pop open the champagne.
I mean, I came in a by-election in 2012 and I've been in opposition ever since, and it's pretty dark and frustrating sitting on your hands and going, no, we'd do it better, and not actually being able to do it. So, of course, there's a lot of optimism, and, of course, everybody I speak to want change. But I'm kind of with Liam. I mean, I don't really believe in polls because I think there's often a dynamic behind them that never actually comes into the public domain, depending on the questions asked and who's funding. But also, I don't think that it is won or lost yet. I agree, there's a lot of undecided on the doors. People are much more thoughtful about how they choose which party to vote for than probably pollsters give them credit for. So I think complacency would be the absolute worst thing. And I think the biggest thing will be turnout, because I think particularly after the Brexit referendum, a lot of people feel frustrated that they weren't heard and they didn't see change. So the big thing will be getting people to actually go out and vote. And if Labour is seen as overconfident, then maybe people will think, oh, I'll give a punt to a Green party.
I should get Sarah to come and give a lecture on the frustrations of opposition. Some of my colleagues, some of them have never been in opposition.
Yeah, they don't want to
And as I say to them, your worst day in government is better than your best day in opposition.
It's very motivating being in opposition.
I'm going to break up this chat now. Thank you very much indeed, Liam and Sarah Dow. Up next on the Politics Hub. Can anyone defeat Donald Trump? We're going to be live in icy Iowa, where the long road to the White House begins.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors. I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it. Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone. I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
Welcome back. Well, it feels like the campaigning never really stopped, with Donald Trump effectively launching his re-election campaign the moment he was ousted in 2020. But today, the US presidential election season kicks off officially with the Iowa caucuses, the traditional opening contest in the race for the White House. Well, joining us now from Des Moines in Iowa, we can speak to Sky News' US election commentator. That is Michael Wolff. Great to have you on the programme. How much does Iowa matter?
Well, Iowa would matter were it not for the fact that Donald Trump is inevitable. The problem with challenging the inevitable is that you already know what's going to happen. And that's the predicament everybody here is in, including the media, that everybody is operating on the absolutely minimal chance that something could disrupt Donald Trump's inevitability. And I would be a person standing with those who say that there is no disrupting the inevitable.
Wow, there you go. I mean, because there has been some talk about Nikki Haley having that momentum, that exciting word, the kind of magic word that changes elections. But you think, forget that. Donald Trump is inevitable.
Well, I would say that's a media word at this point. Momentum, surge. This is there is no real evidence of that except that she might be number 2 instead of number 3. So, and effectively, this race has come down to a race for number 2. So, and that's a race for effectively nothing.
Let's talk a bit about what a Donald Trump presidency would look like. And I know that we're a long way away from that still, even if you say that his nomination is inevitable. Because over here in the UK, people are really watching very carefully to see what that would mean. We've been talking a lot about global affairs in the programme today, threats across the world stage. What would a Donald Trump president mean for that?
Well, on the one hand, no one knows what a Donald Trump presidency would mean. On the other hand, we've already lived through a Donald Trump presidency, so we sort of do have a pretty good indication of what that will mean. And I would say we're looking for a repeat. Donald Trump does what Donald Trump does, and he doesn't much change the script. So I think if Donald Trump were to become president again, it would be another quite chaotic 4 years, and with no clear theme or purpose except perhaps chaos itself.
Blimey. Thank you very much indeed for your frank analysis about the state of the US presidential race. Well, that is it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, though, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee.